The final battle at Pride Rock could have gone very differently. While audiences remember Kiara's inspiring speech about unity, they often overlook how precarious that moment truly was. Zira had spent years preparing for this confrontation, and her defeat hinged on a single factor: her daughter Vitani's last-minute change of heart. But what if that crucial moment had played out differently? Consider the tactical situation. Zira had successfully lured Simba into an ambush, leaving him wounded and vulnerable. Her forces had the high ground, numerical advantage, and most importantly, the element of surprise. The outsiders were battle-hardened, desperate, and completely devoted to their cause. Meanwhile, Simba's pride consisted largely of huntresses who had known only peace for years. The turning point wasn't military strategy, it was psychology. Zira's greatest weapon wasn't her claws or her army, but her ability to manipulate the deepest fears and desires of those around her. She understood that every lion in that confrontation was fighting for something personal, and she knew exactly which emotional buttons to press. In this alternative timeline, when Kiara steps forward with her speech about unity, Zira doesn't lose control. Instead, she does what she does best: she adapts. Rather than charging blindly at Simba, she turns Kiara's own words against her. "Unity?" Zira might have said, circling the young lioness. "You speak of unity while your father banished innocent cubs to starve in the wasteland. Where was unity when Kovu was cast out for the supposed sins of his adoption?" This approach would have been devastatingly effective because it contained a grain of truth. Simba had made mistakes, acted from fear rather than wisdom, and caused genuine harm. Zira's genius lay in taking legitimate grievances and twisting them into weapons of manipulation. The key difference in this scenario is Vitani's reaction. In the original timeline, she was moved by Kiara's words and chose to stand down. But imagine if Zira had prepared for this possibility. What if she had spent years conditioning Vitani not just for loyalty, but for a specific psychological trigger? A carefully crafted lie about Simba's role in some past tragedy that Vitani believed with absolute conviction? When faced with this manipulation, Vitani might have remained loyal not out of blind obedience, but out of genuine belief that she was fighting for justice. This would have prevented the mass defection of the outsiders and maintained Zira's tactical advantage. With her forces intact and Simba's pride demoralized by the failure of Kiara's peace attempt, the battle's outcome becomes inevitable. But Zira's victory wouldn't come through brute force alone. She would have orchestrated a psychological campaign that left Simba's supporters questioning their own convictions. The immediate aftermath reveals the true horror of Zira's character. Unlike Scar, who was ultimately a lazy, self-indulgent ruler, Zira possessed the discipline and strategic thinking of a true dictator. Her first actions as the new ruler of Pride Rock demonstrate a chilling level of premeditation. Rather than executing her enemies outright, which would create martyrs and fuel resistance, Zira implements a more insidious approach. She forces the former Pridelanders to participate in reconciliation ceremonies, where they must publicly confess their crimes against the outsiders. These aren't mere humiliation rituals. They're sophisticated psychological warfare designed to break down individual identity and create complicity. Nala, as Simba's mate and a symbol of the old regime, becomes a particular target. Zira doesn't simply imprison her. She forces Nala to serve as an example of reformed thinking. Every day, Nala must stand before the Pride and recite a prepared statement about the errors of the past and her gratitude for Zira's merciful guidance. This approach serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates Zira's power over even the most respected figures of the old regime, while simultaneously forcing the community to witness the complete submission of their former leaders. The psychological impact on both the observer and the victim is devastating. The fate of other key figures reveals Zira's strategic thinking. Timon and Pumbaa, rather than being banished or eliminated, become unwilling court jesters. Their friendship with Simba makes them valuable propaganda tools, living proof that even the former king's closest allies now serve the new regime. Their natural comedy is twisted into a grotesque parody, forced entertainment that masks the horror of their situation. Most chillingly, Zira understands that her greatest threat isn't military resistance. It's the memory of better times. She systematically begins erasing the cultural legacy of Mufasa's and Simba's reigns. The great ceremonies, the traditions, Even the songs that celebrated the circle of life are either banned or perverted into celebrations of her new order. Zira's inner circle reveals her true genius for manipulation. She doesn't surround herself with simple loyalists, but with individuals whose devotion serves specific psychological functions. Kovu, despite his internal conflict, becomes her reluctant enforcer, proof that even those who once opposed her can be brought to heel. His visible anguish actually serves her purposes, showing others the futility of resistance. The most disturbing aspect of Zira's initial consolidation of power is how she makes her victims complicit in their own oppression. Rather than ruling through fear alone, she creates a system where survival depends on active participation in the new regime's crimes. Former Pridelanders find themselves reporting on their neighbors, participating in loyalty demonstrations, and gradually becoming implicated in the very system they once would have opposed. This psychological architecture reveals why Zira would have been far more dangerous than Scar ever was. While Scar ruled through laziness and delegation to the hyenas, Zira possesses the focused intelligence of a true totalitarian. She understands that lasting power comes not from fear, but from making resistance psychologically impossible. The immediate aftermath of her victory shows a ruler who has learned from every historical mistake, who understands the mechanics of oppression with terrifying clarity, and who possesses the patience and discipline to implement her vision systematically. This isn't the chaotic evil of Scar's reign. This is the calculated horror of a mind that understands exactly how to break not just bodies, but souls. Within weeks of her victory, Zira begins implementing a social restructuring so comprehensive that it makes Scar's chaotic reign look like amateur hour. While Scar had stumbled into power and ruled through impulse, Zira approaches governance like a master architect of oppression, building her new society with terrifying precision. The foundation of Zira's new order rests on what she calls the true heritage, a twisted interpretation of Scar's legacy that goes far beyond anything the original villain ever envisioned. According to Zira's mythology, Scar wasn't simply the rightful king who was unjustly overthrown. He was a visionary prophet who understood the fundamental flaws in the circle of life philosophy. In Zira's telling, the circle of life is revealed as a lie designed to keep the strong subservient to the weak. Lions, as apex predators, were meant to rule absolutely over all other species. The old system, with its emphasis on balance and respect for all creatures, was nothing more than propaganda designed to suppress the natural superiority of lions, and specifically lions who understood their true nature. This ideological framework allows Zira to justify virtually any action as part of restoring the natural order. Unlike Scar, who ruled primarily for personal gratification, Zira presents her brutality as a moral crusade. This distinction makes her infinitely more dangerous, because it provides her followers with righteous justification for their actions. The social hierarchy Zira establishes is both rigid and deliberately fluid, a combination designed to maximize psychological control. At the top are the true believers, outsiders who demonstrated unwavering loyalty to Scar's memory even during their exile. These lions receive preferential treatment and form the backbone of Zira's enforcement apparatus. Below them are the redeemed, former Pridelanders who have proven their conversion to the new ideology through acts of betrayal against their former community. This category is particularly insidious because it rewards treachery while creating a group of supporters who can never return to their old lives. They're bound to the regime by their own crimes. The probationary class consists of former Pridelanders who submit to the new order but haven't yet proven their loyalty through betrayal. These individuals live under constant surveillance and must regularly demonstrate their compliance through increasingly degrading acts of submission. At the bottom are the unreformed, those who show any sign of resistance or nostalgia for the old ways. This group faces systematic humiliation, restricted food access, and serves as a visible warning to others about the consequences of defiance. What makes this system particularly effective is its mobility. Lions can move between categories based on their actions, but movement upward requires increasingly extreme demonstrations of loyalty, while downward movement can happen instantly based on the slightest transgression. This creates a state of constant anxiety where everyone is simultaneously striving to prove their dedication while terrified of making a mistake. The re-education of cubs represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of Zira's new order. Having learned from her own experiences raising Kovu, Nuka, and Vitani, she understands that controlling the next generation is essential for long-term power. However, her approach goes far beyond simple indoctrination. Cubs are separated from their parents at an early age and placed in communal education centers run by true believers. The curriculum focuses not just on loyalty to Zira and hatred of the old regime, but on a fundamental rewiring of moral instincts. Cubs are taught to report on their parents, to find pleasure in the suffering of the unreformed, and to view compassion as weakness. Most disturbing is the systematic destruction of family bonds. Cubs are encouraged to compete with their siblings for favor, creating lifelong rivalries that prevent the formation of loyalty networks outside the state. Traditional stories and songs are replaced with propaganda that glorifies betrayal and presents isolation as strength. The psychological techniques employed are sophisticated. Rather than simply punishing wrong thoughts, the education centers reward cubs for demonstrating the correct emotional responses. A cub who shows distress at another's punishment is not punished directly. Instead, they're subjected to additional education until they learn to hide their empathy so thoroughly that it eventually disappears entirely. Former Prideland cubs face additional challenges. They're constantly reminded of their inferior status as children of the corrupt old regime, but are simultaneously told they can overcome this disadvantage through exceptional dedication. This creates a group of individuals desperate to prove themselves, often becoming the most fanatical supporters of the new order in their effort to escape their origins. The economic restructuring reveals Zira's understanding of how material conditions reinforce social control. The old system of collective hunting and sharing is replaced with a merit-based distribution system where food allocation depends entirely on loyalty rankings. This creates artificial scarcity even when prey is abundant, as food becomes a tool of control rather than sustenance. True believers receive premium cuts and eat first, while the unreformed survive on scraps, if they receive anything at all. This system ensures that resistance isn't just politically dangerous, but physically unsustainable. Malnutrition among the lower castes creates a visible reminder of the consequences of defiance while making organized resistance practically impossible. The hunting parties themselves become instruments of surveillance. Mixed groups of different loyalty levels are sent out together, with each member expected to report on the other's behavior, conversations, and attitudes. This destroys the natural camaraderie of hunting partnerships and ensures that even basic survival activities become opportunities for political enforcement. Perhaps most cunningly, Zira institutes gratitude ceremonies, where those receiving food must publicly thank her regime for their survival. This forced expression of appreciation gradually conditions even resistant individuals to associate their basic needs with the benevolence of their oppressors, creating psychological dependency even among those who intellectually understand their exploitation. The transformation of Pride Rock itself serves as a physical manifestation of the new order. The Great Promontory, once a symbol of majesty and openness, becomes a fortress of surveillance. Elevated platforms are constructed at strategic points, always occupied by true believers who monitor the activities below. The natural beauty of the location is deliberately marred with symbols of Scar's legacy, crude carvings and displays that serve no purpose except to remind everyone that the old world is gone. Living spaces are redistributed based on loyalty rankings, with true believers occupying the choicest spots while the unreformed are relegated to the most exposed and uncomfortable areas. Privacy becomes a privilege that must be earned through demonstration of absolute compliance. What makes Zira's system more effective than Scar's chaotic rule is its predictability. While Scar's subjects never knew what might provoke his wrath, Zira's rules are clear and consistent. This creates a false sense of security. Obey the rules, demonstrate loyalty, and survival is possible. This predictability actually makes the oppression more tolerable in the short term, which helps prevent the kind of desperate uprising that eventually overthrew Scar. However, this same predictability serves Zira's deeper purpose: the complete psychological transformation of her subjects. By making survival contingent on active participation in oppression, she doesn't just control behavior, she corrupts souls. Over time, the line between performance and genuine belief becomes blurred, even for those who initially resisted. The most sophisticated aspect of Zira's psychological warfare is how she uses the victim's own moral frameworks against them. Lions who believe in redemption are told they can earn forgiveness through service. Those who value family are forced to choose between protecting their loved ones and maintaining their principles. Those who believe in justice are convinced that the old regime's crimes justify any response. This systematic corruption of individual moral compasses ensures that even if her political control were somehow overthrown, the psychological damage would persist for generations. Zira doesn't just want to rule, she wants to fundamentally alter what it means to be a lion in the Pride Lands. 6 months into Zira's rule, the true horror of her psychological mastery becomes apparent. What initially appeared to be a harsh but stable new order reveals itself as something far more sinister. A systematic campaign to destroy the very concept of individual identity within the Pride Lands. The surveillance state Zira creates goes beyond simple observation. Every lion becomes both watcher and watched in an intricate web of mutual monitoring that makes private thought virtually impossible. The genius of her system lies in how it transforms natural social bonds into instruments of oppression. Morning assemblies become daily exercises in psychological warfare. All lions must gather at dawn to recite loyalty pledges, but these aren't mere rote ceremonies. Each day features different lions randomly selected to demonstrate their dedication through increasingly elaborate displays of devotion. These performances aren't just for Zira's benefit. They're designed to force every member of the community to witness their neighbor's degradation and complicity. The unpredictability of selection creates constant anxiety. No one knows when they might be called upon to prove their loyalty, so everyone must be perpetually prepared to sacrifice their dignity, their principles, or their relationships for survival. This state of constant readiness for betrayal gradually erodes the psychological boundaries that define individual identity. The loyalty tests themselves reveal Zira's sophisticated understanding of human, or rather lion, psychology. Rather than simply demanding expressions of support, she requires actions that force participants to violate their own moral frameworks. A lion who values honesty might be required to publicly fabricate accusations against a friend. Someone who prizes family loyalty could be commanded to denounce their own cubs for imaginary infractions. These tests serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They provide Zira with information about who can be corrupted and how far they're willing to go. They isolate potential resistors by forcing their friends and family to participate in their humiliation. Most importantly, they gradually condition the entire population to accept that survival requires the abandonment of principle. The public shaming rituals represent perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Zira's rule. Unlike Scar's occasional fits of rage, these ceremonies are carefully choreographed, psychological torture sessions designed to break not just the immediate victim, but everyone forced to witness them. The victim, usually someone who showed insufficient enthusiasm during loyalty demonstrations, is placed in the center of the gathering while community members are required to list their failures and shortcomings. The twisted brilliance lies in how Zira structures these accusations. Rather than allowing generic condemnations, she requires specific personal details that could only come from intimate knowledge of the victim's private life. This forces friends and family members to either reveal their loved one's vulnerabilities or face punishment themselves. The betrayal cuts both ways. The victim experiences the horror of intimate betrayal, while those forced to participate carry the guilt of their compliance. Neither can ever trust the other completely again, effectively destroying the social bonds that might otherwise support resistance. Children are not exempt from these rituals. They're often the primary targets. Zira understands that public humiliation of cubs creates trauma that lasts lifetimes, while simultaneously demonstrating to adults the futility of protecting their young. Parents face impossible choices: defend their cubs and face punishment that might leave the children completely unprotected, or participate in their humiliation to maintain the ability to provide some minimal protection. The systematic destruction of family bonds extends beyond these dramatic ceremonies into the fabric of daily life. Zira institutes policies that seem practical but serve to fragment relationships. Food distribution requires family members to formally rank each other's worthiness, creating artificial competition for basic survival. Housing assignments deliberately separate families, supposedly for optimal social integration, but actually to prevent the formation of loyalty networks outside state control. Most insidiously, private conversations become impossible. The surveillance network doesn't rely on formal informants, but on the assumption that everyone is reporting on everyone else. This creates a situation where even intimate family relationships become performances of loyalty to the regime, as anyone might be testing anyone else's dedication. The psychological impact manifests in ways that would have been unimaginable under Scar's chaotic rule. Lions begin self-censoring not just their speech but their thoughts, developing internal voices that constantly evaluate whether their mental reactions are sufficiently loyal. The boundary between public performance and private belief becomes so blurred that many genuinely lose track of their own authentic feelings. Sleep becomes fitful and troubled as dreams themselves feel dangerous. What if someone talks in their sleep? What if their unconscious mind reveals insufficient devotion? The most basic human psychological processes become sources of anxiety and self-doubt. Zira's treatment of Kovu provides a masterclass in psychological manipulation that demonstrates why her methods surpass even the most sophisticated historical examples of authoritarian control. Rather than simply demanding his obedience, she creates conditions where his resistance actually serves her purposes. Kovu's visible anguish and internal conflict don't represent failures in Zira's system. They're features. His obvious suffering demonstrates to others that even her chosen heir can't escape the psychological prison she's created. His attempts to show mercy or protect others are allowed to succeed just enough to give him hope, then systematically undermined to reinforce his helplessness. The cruelest aspect of Kovu's situation is how Zira uses his genuine capacity for love against him. She ensures that every act of kindness he shows toward others results in subtle punishment for those recipients. This creates a situation where his natural compassion becomes a source of harm to those he cares about, gradually conditioning him to suppress the very qualities that make him admirable. When Kovu finally reaches his breaking point, it doesn't manifest as heroic rebellion but as psychological collapse. The constant pressure to be simultaneously loyal son and secret dissenter, public enforcer and private protector, finally fractures his sense of self entirely. He becomes catatonic not from external trauma but from the impossibility of maintaining coherent identity under such contradictory demands. This breakdown serves Zira's purposes perfectly. It demonstrates the futility of internal resistance while providing her with an excuse to implement even harsher controls. Kovu's condition becomes evidence that the old ways of thinking, compassion, individual conscience, personal loyalty, are literally forms of mental illness that require treatment through deeper integration with the new order. The environmental degradation of the Pride Lands under Zira's rule reflects the psychological devastation she inflicts on its inhabitants. Unlike Scar's neglect, which led to natural decay, Zira's policies actively damage the ecosystem in service of social control. Hunting grounds are deliberately overexploited not from necessity but to create artificial scarcity that reinforces the food-based hierarchy. Water sources are controlled and rationed not for conservation, but to ensure that access remains a privilege that can be revoked. The very landscape becomes a tool of oppression. The contrast with Scar's reign becomes starkly apparent when examining the different types of fear each ruler generated. Under Scar, lions feared unpredictable violence and neglect, external threats to physical survival. Under Zira, they fear the loss of their own moral identity, the corruption of their relationships, and the gradual dissolution of everything that makes them recognizably themselves. Scar's victims could maintain their essential dignity even in defeat, holding on to their principles and relationships as sources of strength. Zira's victims find these very strengths turned against them, transformed into vulnerabilities that make resistance not just dangerous but psychologically impossible. The realization that Zira's methods make Scar look merciful by comparison doesn't come from the scale of physical brutality, though that certainly exists, but from the recognition that she attacks the soul itself. Scar could break bodies and destroy lives, but his victims remained fundamentally themselves. Under Zira's psychological warfare, the very concept of individual identity becomes a casualty. This systematic assault on psychological integrity represents a form of evil that goes beyond simple tyranny into something approaching the erasure of lions as thinking, feeling beings. The horror isn't just what Zira does to her subjects. It's what she makes them do to themselves and each other in the name of survival. Even under Zira's suffocating psychological control, the spark of resistance refuses to be completely extinguished. What emerges, however, looks nothing like the heroic rebellions of traditional stories. Instead, it resembles the desperate, fragmented networks of historical underground movements, small, isolated, and operating under constant threat of discovery and annihilation. The most surprising aspect of the resistance isn't who leads it, but how leadership itself must be completely reimagined under Zira's surveillance state. Traditional authority figures, the strongest lions, the most charismatic speakers, the natural organizers, are either too closely watched or have been too thoroughly compromised to serve as focal points for opposition. Instead, the resistance emerges from the most overlooked and underestimated members of the community. Timon and Pumbaa, initially forced into their roles as court jesters, gradually transform their apparent submission into the perfect cover for subversive activity. Their status as entertainment makes them uniquely mobile within Zira's rigid social hierarchy, able to move between different loyalty groups without arousing suspicion. The genius of their position lies in how it exploits Zira's own psychological blind spots. Her focus on controlling lions makes her dismiss the meerkats and warthog as irrelevant comic relief. Their forced performances, designed to humiliate Simba's memory, become opportunities to embed coded messages that only careful listeners can decode. A seemingly innocent joke about digging for grubs in all the wrong places becomes a signal about safe meeting locations. A comedic routine about forgetting where you buried your favorite treats communicates information about hidden supply caches. Their bumbling persona provides perfect camouflage for sophisticated intelligence gathering and message relay systems. The development of coded communication represents one of the most sophisticated aspects of the underground network. Under Zira's regime, where every conversation is potentially monitored and every relationship scrutinized, traditional forms of coordination become impossible. The resistance develops an intricate system based on seemingly innocent cultural references that predate Zira's rule. A comment about the stars looking particularly bright near the watering hole might indicate a planned gathering. Humming certain traditional melodies in specific sequences conveys complex tactical information. Even grooming patterns and sleeping positions become elements of a secret language. These codes must be subtle enough to avoid detection while remaining clear enough for coordination. The challenge is immense because Zira's psychological manipulation has made many lions genuinely uncertain about their own loyalties. Someone might decode a message correctly but hesitate to act, unsure whether their impulse to resist represents genuine conviction or a test of their loyalty to the regime. The role of spiritual elements in the resistance reveals another dimension of Zira's failure to completely control the Pride Lands. While she can monitor physical actions and spoken words, the connection to the great kings of the past operates on a level that transcends her surveillance capabilities. Lions begin reporting dreams and visions with increasing frequency. Communications from Mufasa, Simba, and other departed rulers who provide guidance and encouragement to those struggling under oppression. These spiritual experiences can't be directly monitored or controlled, creating a space for psychological resistance that exists beyond Zira's reach. However, even these spiritual communications must be approached with extreme caution. Zira's psychological conditioning has made many lions doubt their own perceptions. Is that really Mufasa's voice offering guidance, or is it wishful thinking? Could these visions be hallucinations brought on by malnutrition and stress? The uncertainty itself becomes another form of psychological torture. Some lions begin developing rituals that allow them to maintain connection with the old ways while appearing to comply with the new order. Private moments of meditation disguised as rest periods. Silent recitations of traditional blessings during mandatory loyalty ceremonies. These small acts of spiritual resistance provide psychological anchors that help preserve individual identity under pressure. The network structure reflects the harsh realities of operating under totalitarian surveillance. Rather than a centralized organization with clear hierarchies, the resistance exists as a collection of isolated cells with minimal connections to each other. This compartmentalization means that the discovery of one group doesn't automatically compromise the entire network, but it also severely limits coordination and effectiveness. Each cell typically consists of 3 to 5 lions who knew each other before Zira's rise to power. Family relationships, hunting partnerships, and childhood friendships provide the only basis for trust in a world where anyone might be an informant. Even within these small groups, members often can't be completely certain of each other's loyalty, creating an atmosphere of necessary paranoia that makes planning extremely difficult. The resistance activities themselves are necessarily limited and primarily focused on survival rather than active opposition. Hidden food caches help sustain lions who fall into the unreformed category. Secret medical care for those injured during loyalty demonstrations or punishment rituals. Psychological support for lions, showing signs of complete breakdown under the pressure of constant surveillance. These activities, while modest, serve crucial functions beyond their practical benefits. They demonstrate that cooperation and mutual aid remain possible even under Zira's system, providing psychological proof that her ideology of self-interested competition isn't the only way lions can relate to each other. The failed uprising attempts reveal both the courage of the resistance and the sophistication of Zira's countermeasures. Unlike Scar, who might have been caught off guard by organized opposition, Zira has anticipated resistance and prepared systematic responses. The first major attempt occurs roughly 8 months into her reign, when a coalition of former Pride Land huntresses tries to coordinate a simultaneous strike during a morning assembly. The plan relies on the assumption that many lions will join them once they see others acting, creating a cascade of rebellion that overcomes Zira's loyal forces through sheer numbers. The uprising fails catastrophically, not because of poor planning or bad luck, but because Zira has been aware of it from the beginning. Her surveillance network identified the conspiracy in its early stages, but rather than immediately crushing it, she allowed it to develop while monitoring its growth. This provided her with detailed intelligence about resistance networks and individual loyalties. When the uprising finally begins, Zira's response demonstrates the psychological sophistication that makes her far more dangerous than Scar. Rather than simply crushing the rebellion through violence, she turns it into a teaching moment that strengthens her control. The rebels find themselves isolated, not because other lions lack courage, but because Zira has pre-positioned loyal forces who immediately begin protecting innocent community members from the violent extremists. The narrative she's constructed portrays the resistance not as freedom fighters, but as dangerous radicals, threatening the stability that the community has finally achieved under her rule. Most devastating is how she manipulates the aftermath. Rather than mass executions that might create martyrs, Zira implements a reconciliation process where the failed rebels must publicly confess their errors and ask forgiveness from the community members they endangered with their reckless actions. This process serves multiple purposes. It reinforces the narrative that resistance equals selfishness, it forces the rebels to participate in their own humiliation, and it makes the community complicit in accepting the regime's version of events. Lions who might have been sympathetic to the resistance find themselves nodding along with condemnations of the rebels' extremism. The psychological impact on both participants and observers is devastating. Future resistance efforts must overcome not just fear of punishment, but the internalized belief that opposition to Zira represents a form of moral failure that endangers innocent community members. Subsequent attempts at organized resistance become increasingly desperate and poorly coordinated as the surveillance network tightens, and potential supporters become genuinely convinced that stability under oppression is preferable to the chaos of rebellion. The resistance gradually evolves from dreams of liberation to more modest goals of preserving small spaces of humanity within an inhuman system. Secret acts of kindness, moments of genuine connection despite the surveillance, small rituals that maintain connection to better times and values. These limited victories might seem pathetic compared to dramatic tales of heroic rebellion, but they represent something more profound. The refusal to allow evil to completely triumph, even when victory seems impossible. Under Zira's psychological warfare, the simple act of maintaining compassion becomes a form of resistance that she cannot fully eliminate without destroying the society she seeks to control. The underground networks serve as proof that even the most sophisticated totalitarian systems cannot completely erase the human or lion capacity for moral choice. Individual lions continue to choose kindness over cruelty, truth over lies, and connection over isolation, even when these choices offer no practical benefit and considerable risk. This persistent spark of resistance doesn't threaten Zira's immediate control, but it plants seeds for future possibilities while preserving something essential about what it means to be part of a community rather than merely subjects of a ruler. The seeds of Zira's downfall aren't planted by her enemies. They're cultivated by the very system she created to ensure her eternal dominance. After 18 months of rule, the psychological machinery that made her regime so effective begins consuming itself, revealing the fundamental instability lurking beneath her apparent control. The paranoia that served Zira so well during her rise becomes a cancer during her reign. The surveillance network that eliminated external threats gradually turns inward, as the logic of suspicion demands ever greater vigilance against betrayal from within. True believers find themselves subjected to the same scrutiny they once directed at others, discovering that no level of loyalty provides permanent security. The first crack appears when Vitani, one of Zira's most trusted enforcers, begins showing signs of psychological strain. The constant pressure of maintaining absolute loyalty while witnessing daily atrocities gradually erodes her mental stability. Her increasing reluctance to participate in loyalty demonstrations doesn't go unnoticed by other true believers eager to advance their own positions. Rather than addressing Vitani's obvious distress with the maternal concern she once showed, Zira applies the same cold analysis she uses on all potential threats. Vitani's value as an enforcer is weighed against her potential as a source of rebellion, and the calculation proves devastating. The daughter who once represented Zira's greatest success becomes marked for correction. The public humiliation of Vitani sends shockwaves through the true believer class. If even Zira's own daughter isn't safe from suspicion, then no one is. The revelation transforms the ruling class from confident enforcers into nervous survivors, each wondering who might be next on the list of those requiring additional loyalty verification. This shift fundamentally alters the dynamic of Zira's rule. The true believers begin hedging their bets, showing slightly less enthusiasm in their enforcement duties, while quietly positioning themselves to survive a potential regime change. Their reduced effectiveness creates gaps in the surveillance network that had previously seemed impenetrable. The environmental collapse of the Pride Lands accelerates as Zira's attention becomes increasingly focused on internal threats rather than practical governance. The artificial scarcity she created to maintain social control has evolved into genuine resource depletion that threatens the survival of the entire ecosystem. Unlike Scar's reign, where environmental degradation resulted from neglect and incompetence, the ecological disaster under Zira stems from deliberate policies that prioritize control over sustainability. The overexploitation of hunting grounds, the contamination of water sources through territorial marking rituals, and the disruption of natural animal migration patterns all serve political purposes that override ecological concerns. The irony becomes apparent as the physical environment begins reflecting the psychological devastation Zira has inflicted on the community. The Pride Lands, once a symbol of natural harmony and abundance, transform into a wasteland that mirrors the spiritual emptiness of its inhabitants. The degradation isn't just environmental, it's existential. The breaking point comes when a severe drought coincides with the collapse of the remaining prey populations. For the first time since taking power, Zira faces a crisis that can't be solved through psychological manipulation or political maneuvering. The physical reality of starvation affects all loyalty categories equally, creating a shared experience that transcends her carefully constructed social divisions. The final rebellion emerges not from the underground resistance networks, which had been largely neutralized, but from an unexpected alliance between the most unlikely conspirators. Former true believers who have fallen from grace and unreformed, lions who have nothing left to lose. This coalition possesses unique advantages that previous resistance efforts lacked. The fallen true believers understand Zira's psychological methods and security procedures from the inside, while the unreformed provide the moral clarity and desperate courage necessary for action. Most importantly, their alliance demonstrates that Zira's system has become so oppressive that it creates enemies even among its former beneficiaries. The catalyst for action comes when Zira announces her intention to implement final solutions for persistent loyalty problems. The euphemistic language can't disguise her plan to eliminate entire families suspected of harboring resistant sympathies. This crosses a line that even some true believers can't accept, providing the coalition with unexpected allies among the regime's enforcement apparatus. The rebellion itself unfolds not as a dramatic military confrontation, but as a systematic unraveling of Zira's psychological control mechanisms. Rather than trying to defeat her forces through direct confrontation, the coalition focuses on disrupting the surveillance networks and communication systems that maintain her power. Key to their success is the exploitation of Zira's own paranoia against her. False intelligence about imaginary betrayals within her inner circle creates a cascade of purges that eliminates loyal supporters while sparing actual rebels. The psychological warfare techniques she perfected become weapons in the hands of those who understand her methods intimately. The environmental crisis provides crucial tactical advantages. With the Pride Lands no longer able to support the population, traditional territorial controls become meaningless. Lions desperate for survival ignore boundary restrictions and gathering prohibitions, creating chaos that the depleted security forces can't contain. Zira's psychological breakdown manifests not as dramatic madness, but as a gradual disconnection from reality that mirrors the dissociation she forced on her subjects. Faced with the collapse of the system she spent years perfecting, she retreats into elaborate fantasies where her policies are succeeding, and the rebellion is merely a temporary setback requiring minor adjustments. Her final moments reveal the ultimate emptiness of her philosophy. Surrounded by the ruins of her regime and abandoned by all but the most fanatical supporters, Zira continues issuing orders and making plans as if her authority still means something. The psychological techniques that once seemed so sophisticated are revealed as desperate attempts to impose meaning on chaos through sheer force of will. When she finally meets her end, it comes not through heroic confrontation, but through the simple reality that systems built on fear and oppression eventually consume themselves. Her demise represents not just the fall of a tyrant, but the collapse of an entire worldview that prioritized control over survival, ideology over reality, and power over life itself. The aftermath proves more tragic than triumphant. While Zira's regime has ended, the damage it inflicted extends far beyond political structures into the fundamental fabric of Pride Land society. The lions who survive her rule carry psychological scars that will never fully heal, and the cultural traditions that once defined their community have been so thoroughly corrupted that restoration seems impossible. The environmental degradation provides a physical metaphor for the spiritual devastation. The Pride Lands can theoretically recover their ecological balance given time and proper stewardship, but the timeline for healing spans generations. Similarly, the psychological wounds inflicted by Zira's systematic assault on individual identity and social bonds will affect not just survivors, but their cubs and their cubs' cubs. Perhaps most tragically, many of the lions who participated in Zira's system, whether as enforcers, informants, or merely compliant subjects, struggle with profound guilt that poisons their ability to enjoy freedom. They understand intellectually that survival often required compromise, but the emotional reality of their complicity creates internal conflicts that mirror the external devastation surrounding them. The few resistance fighters who survived Zira's purges find themselves inheriting a broken world where the very concepts of trust, community, and shared values must be rebuilt from scratch. The simple act of holding a conversation without coded language or hidden meanings becomes a skill that must be consciously relearned. The most haunting aspect of the aftermath is the recognition that some victories cost everything worth winning. The Pride Lands are free from Zira's oppression, but they're also free from much of what made them the Pride Lands in the first place. The culture, traditions, and social bonds that once defined the community have been so thoroughly shattered that recovery may be impossible. This realization provides the ultimate judgment on Zira's regime. While Scar's rule was destructive and chaotic, it was also temporary and ultimately reversible. The Pride Lands could recover from his neglect and incompetence because the fundamental structures of their society remained intact beneath the surface damage. Zira's legacy is different. She didn't just break things, she poisoned them. Her systematic assault on the psychological and social foundations of Pride Land civilization created wounds that go deeper than political oppression into the realm of existential trauma. Even in defeat, her influence continues to shape the community she sought to control. The story of what might have happened if Zira had won serves as a reminder that some forms of evil are more dangerous than others. The tyrant who rules through fear and violence can be overthrown and replaced. The one who corrupts souls and destroys the very capacity for trust and love leaves scars that persist long after their political power has ended. In the end, Zira's hypothetical victory would have represented not just the conquest of a territory, but the annihilation of a way of life. Her rule would have transformed the Pride Lands into something unrecognizable, not just politically, but spiritually. The community that emerged from her reign might have borne the same name and occupied the same territory, but it would have been populated by fundamentally different beings, shaped by fundamentally different values, living in a fundamentally different world. The true horror of this alternative timeline isn't the suffering Zira would have inflicted, but the recognition that some forms of damage cannot be undone, and some victories cost more than defeat ever could.